The case of the Black Dahlia, the mysterious and gruesome murder of Elizabeth Short, is one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. It has haunted both the public and investigators for over 70 years, sparking numerous theories, investigations, and speculations. Elizabeth Short, an aspiring actress from Boston, was found brutally murdered on January 15, 1947, in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. Her body was severed at the waist, and she had been drained of blood. The nature of her death was shocking, but the circumstances surrounding the murder, how her body was posed, the taunting letters the killer sent to the press, and the absence of a clear motive, make this case all the more baffling. The brutality of Elizabeth Short's death was matched only by the media frenzy that followed. In the days after her body was discovered, newspapers across the country began to report on the case in chilling detail. The press dubbed her the Black Dahlia, a name that would become synonymous with mystery, intrigue, and unsolved crime. The circumstances of her murder were unlike any the public had seen before, and the media coverage only intensified the sense of urgency to solve the case. As the investigation began, the authorities had few clues to work with. Elizabeth Short's body had been found in a vacant lot in the Lymont Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, and there were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints, and no immediate evidence to suggest who might have been responsible. The only thing that was clear was the brutal nature of her death. Her body had been severed at the waist and posed in a grotesque manner, with her arms raised above her head, her legs spread apart, and her mouth cut into a gruesome, wide smile. The killer had gone to great lengths to ensure that Elizabeth's body was displayed for maximum shock value. But why? What could have motivated such a grotesque act? Theories about who the killer was and why Elizabeth Short was targeted have persisted for decades. One of the most compelling theories is that Elizabeth was murdered by someone who knew her, someone with a personal connection to her life. However, as the investigation unfolded, more questions arose, and the case began to take on a darker, more complex nature. Some investigators speculated that the killer was a deranged individual, someone who had been watching Elizabeth for some time, while others believed that the murder could have been the result of a love triangle gone wrong. Could the killer have been someone from Hollywood, someone who had met Elizabeth in her search for fame? As the investigation continued, the authorities found little physical evidence to point them in the right direction. There were no witnesses to the crime, and no one had seen anything suspicious in the area on the night of the murder. The only clues that seemed to surface were the strange, cryptic letters that began to arrive at the Los Angeles newspapers. These letters, which were sent by the killer himself, contained taunts and bizarre confessions, and they only served to deepen the mystery. The killer's letters were filled with details that only someone close to the crime could have known. One of the most chilling aspects of the letters was that the killer seemed to take pleasure in tormenting the police and the public. He reveled in the attention that the murder case brought, and his letters taunted law enforcement for their inability to catch him. The letters often contained strange symbols, cryptic messages, and threats, all designed to keep the public on edge. Some of these letters were so disturbing that they seemed to suggest that the killer was actively watching the investigation unfold. Over time, the police began to suspect that Elizabeth Short's murder might have been part of a larger pattern of killings in the Los Angeles area. Could the Black Dahlia case have been linked to other unsolved murders? Some investigators began to believe that the killer may have been responsible for multiple deaths, each one more brutal than the last. But despite numerous leads and potential suspects, the police could not connect any other murders to the Black Dahlia case. The investigation was further complicated by the influx of false tips and confessions. As the case gained more attention, a number of people came forward claiming to have information about the murder. Some of these individuals seemed to be attention-seeking individuals, while others appeared to have legitimate information. However, none of these leads panned out, and the investigation became increasingly bogged down by false hopes. One of the most significant suspects in the case was George Hodel, a wealthy doctor who had lived in Los Angeles at the time of the murder. Hodel was an eccentric man with a troubled past, and his name became linked to the Black Dahlia case after a number of unusual details about his life emerged. Hodel was a known associate of several prominent individuals in Los Angeles, including members of the city's elite circles, and some investigators believed that his connections could have played a role in the murder. There were also rumors that Hodel had a troubled relationship with his daughter, and that Elizabeth Short may have had connections to him through his daughter's circle of friends. However, despite these suspicions, there was no definitive proof linking Hodel to the crime. Hodel's involvement in the case was further explored when his son, Steve Hodel, became a private investigator and began investigating his father's past. In his book, Black Dahlia Avenger, Steve Hodel argued that his father was the killer, citing a number of circumstantial pieces of evidence, including the fact that Hodel had been living near the crime scene at the time of the murder. He also pointed to Hodel's possible motive, claiming that his father had a history of violent behavior and had been involved in several other questionable activities. While some found Hodel's theory convincing, others dismissed it as speculative, pointing out that there was no concrete evidence to definitively link George Hodel to the crime. Despite the ongoing investigation and new theories that emerged over the years, the Black Dahlia case remained unsolved. The killer was never caught, and Elizabeth Short's murder became one of the most famous and enduring mysteries in true crime history. The case continues to captivate the public, inspiring countless books, documentaries, and films. But even with all the attention it has garnered over the years, the identity of the Black Dahlia killer remains a mystery. As the years passed and the investigation continued, new theories about Elizabeth Short's death emerged. While some of the earlier suspects were either dismissed or never proven to be connected to the crime, others gained more attention. The idea of a well-planned, calculated murder began to seem more plausible, especially as investigators continued to uncover strange details surrounding Elizabeth's life and the events leading up to her death. Could the key to solving the mystery lie in Elizabeth's connections to Hollywood and the powerful figures she may have encountered during her brief time in Los Angeles? Elizabeth Short had come to Los Angeles in 1943 with dreams of becoming an actress. While she had only small roles and didn't achieve the fame she desired, she did spend time in Hollywood social circles, and some theorists suggest that she may have crossed paths with individuals who could have been dangerous. Several witnesses later claimed that Elizabeth had been seen in the company of influential men in Los Angeles, including those tied to the film industry. But who among them might have had a motive to kill her? In the 1970s, a new theory about Elizabeth Short's murder began to gain traction, particularly through the work of several journalists and amateur investigators. Some believed that Elizabeth had been involved with a powerful man who was connected to the Hollywood elite, possibly someone who didn't want his relationship with her to become public. The theory suggested that Elizabeth's murder might have been a crime of passion, committed by someone who wanted to silence her before she could reveal something damaging. One such suspect was Dr. George Hodel, the aforementioned Los Angeles physician who had been a significant figure in the case. Dr. Hodel was a man of privilege and mystery, with a history of strange behavior and associations with people of influence. Hodel's involvement in the Black Dahlia case remained largely speculative until his son, Steve Hodel, began his own investigation into his father's life. Steve Hodel's research raised disturbing questions about his father's potential involvement in the murder, leading him to suspect that George Hodel had killed Elizabeth Short. Steve Hodel's book, Black Dahlia Avenger, pointed to several pieces of circumstantial evidence, including photographs, testimonies, and Hodel's possible motive, which suggested that his father may have been the killer. Despite Steve Hodel's theories and his attempts to link his father to the crime, no direct evidence has ever been found to definitively prove George Hodel's involvement in the murder. The case against him remains circumstantial, and while many find his theories compelling, the question of whether Hodel was actually the killer remains unanswered. The lack of concrete evidence, combined with the passage of time, made it difficult to convict anyone, especially someone as well connected as George Hodel. While the Hodel theory continued to be popular in some circles, other investigators began to consider different possibilities. One such possibility was that Elizabeth's murder was the result of a serial killer who had targeted other women in Los Angeles around the same time. Some investigators began to look at other unsolved cases, believing that the Black Dahlia murder could be linked to a larger pattern of killings in the area. The Los Angeles Police Department had failed to connect the dots in the early days of the investigation, but the passage of time allowed for a more thorough review of cold cases, and some investigators began to believe that Elizabeth Short's murder might have been the work of a maniac who had struck before and continued to strike after her death. The idea of a serial killer seemed plausible to many, given the brutal nature of the murder and the striking similarities between the Black Dahlia case and other unsolved murders in the region. There were several other cases of women who had been killed in a similar manner, with the same level of violence and mutilation. Some investigators speculated that the killer might have been a man with a deep, twisted need for recognition and control, someone who reveled in the media attention that came with the brutality of the murders. The Black Dahlia case, in this theory, was simply one part of a much larger pattern of killings that had gone unnoticed at the time. Despite the many theories that emerged over the years, no conclusive evidence has ever been found to solve the Black Dahlia case. Every suspect, every theory, every lead eventually proved to be dead ends. The killer remained anonymous, and Elizabeth Short's brutal death went unpunished. Her murder became a symbol of the cruel, unsolvable mysteries that haunt the world of true crime. It is a case that continues to fascinate and terrify, but the truth remains elusive. In the years since Elizabeth's murder, the Black Dahlia case has taken on a life of its own in popular culture. It has inspired countless books, documentaries, films, and TV shows, each one adding a new layer to the mythos surrounding Elizabeth Short's death. The case has become synonymous with mystery and intrigue, and the name Black Dahlia evokes images of glamour, horror, and an unanswerable question. Who killed Elizabeth Short, and why? As the investigation stalled and the case grew colder, the police were forced to shift their focus. New leads became harder to come by, and the evidence left behind by the killer grew increasingly stale. For many years, the Black Dahlia case appeared to be an insurmountable enigma, one that no one would be able to solve. However, in the 1980s and 1990s, interest in the case was revived when Steve Hodl's book brought the theory of George Hodl's involvement back into the public eye. As new forensic techniques were developed, some investigators began to believe that the case might finally be solvable. Forensic advances, such as DNA testing, gave the case new life. In the early 2000s, the lab began to apply new DNA techniques to cold cases, including the Black Dahlia case. The hope was that modern forensic tools would be able to uncover something that had been missed in the initial investigation. But despite the new technology, no breakthroughs have been made. The Black Dahlia case remains unsolved, and Elizabeth Short's murderer continues to elude justice. Even so, the investigation continues to this day. While many theories and suspects have come and gone, the mystery surrounding Elizabeth Short's death has never been solved. The case remains open, and some detectives continue to work on it in the hopes of uncovering the truth. For Elizabeth Short's family, the pain of not knowing what happened to her has never gone away. The questions still remain: who killed Elizabeth Short, and why? Was it George Hodl? Was it a stranger? Was it someone close to her? As the months passed without any major breakthroughs, the investigation into Asha Degree's disappearance began to feel like an insurmountable puzzle. Each lead seemed to fade into nothingness, leaving investigators and the Degree family grasping at straws. Yet, despite the passage of time, the case was not forgotten. The community in Shelby continued to hold on to the hope that one day, Asha would be found and brought back home. Her family refused to accept that their daughter was simply gone, and they clung to the belief that someone, somewhere, knew something that could lead to answers. The case had a profound impact on the small town of Shelby. The disappearance of a 9-year-old child shook the entire community to its core. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had heard Asha's story all tried to help in any way they could. But as the investigation wore on, the frustration grew. There were no signs of Asha, no confirmed sightings, and no credible leads. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving only the haunting question of why. Despite the dwindling public attention, the Degree family did everything they could to keep the search alive. They kept talking to the media, reaching out to anyone who might have information. They distributed flyers with Asha's picture, hoping that someone would remember something, anything, that could shed light on the case. They even enlisted the help of private investigators, hoping that fresh eyes on the case could bring a breakthrough. As the years passed, the investigation turned to more unconventional methods. Investigators began to look at the psychological angle, questioning whether Asha's disappearance could have been related to an emotional breakdown. Some speculated that Asha might have been experiencing personal struggles that led her to run away, perhaps as a result of stress or conflict at home. But there were no signs of this. Asha had always been a happy, well-adjusted child. She had no history of emotional issues, and her family life appeared to be stable. The theory that she had run away seemed increasingly unlikely. Then, new questions began to surface. Could Asha have been the victim of a random abduction? This was a chilling thought, but one that had to be considered. In the years since her disappearance, there had been reports of other children vanishing under similar circumstances. Had Asha been taken by someone who had been following her? Had the abductor been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Investigators began to turn their attention to the possibility of a serial offender, someone who had a pattern of targeting young girls. This theory, however, would lead them down yet another confusing path. Despite numerous leads and countless hours of investigation, there was still no evidence linking anyone to Asha's case. In the years following Asha's disappearance, the case remained open but stagnant. The evidence was sparse, and the lack of new information made it difficult for investigators to make progress. Theories continued to swirl, but without solid leads, they remained just that, speculation. Asha's family, however, refused to give up. They continued to search for their daughter, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. It wasn't until 2004 that a significant new lead emerged. A tip from a local resident claimed to have seen a young girl matching Ash's description in a nearby town, just a few miles from Shelby. The person who came forward had seen the girl in the back of a car, being driven away by an older man. The tip was vague, but it was enough to reignite the investigation. Police followed up on the lead, interviewing witnesses and attempting to trace the car seen in the area. But, as with so many other leads, this one too came to a dead end. The car couldn't be identified, and the young girl seen in the backseat was never conclusively identified as Asha. The search continued, but the trail remained cold. Over the years, Asha's case became one of the most well-known unsolved disappearances in North Carolina. It was a case that tugged at the hearts of many, not just because of the chilling circumstances of Asha's disappearance, but because of the unanswered questions that continued to haunt the investigation. What had happened to this little girl? Had she been abducted? Was she still alive? Or had something even darker happened to her? By the time 2011 rolled around, a decade had passed since Asha Degree's disappearance. The case was still open, but as each year went by, it seemed less and less likely that anyone would ever come forward with the key to solving the mystery. However, in that same year, a significant shift occurred. New forensic methods and advances in DNA analysis were beginning to offer investigators new hope. Could DNA technology finally provide the breakthrough the case so desperately needed? DNA analysis had played a significant role in solving many cold cases across the country, and now, it was being applied to Asha's case. Investigators began to go back over the evidence that had been collected over the years, including hair samples, fibers, and other physical evidence that had been found at the scene. With the advancement of DNA testing techniques, there was a renewed sense of optimism. Could this be the key to solving the case? Could DNA analysis finally unlock the mystery of what happened to Asha Degree? In the meantime, the Degree family continued their search, growing more desperate with each passing year. They held vigils, spoke to the media, and kept Asha's face in the public eye. They refused to let her be forgotten. Their love for Asha never wavered, and they held on to the hope that one day, they would finally get the answers they so desperately needed. Despite the renewed efforts, the case still remained unsolved. However, as new leads and fresh evidence continued to be discovered, there was still hope. The case was far from over, and Asha's family knew that they could never give up. In the years following, as technology continued to advance, investigators began to uncover more and more potential leads. Some led to false hopes, while others opened up new avenues of investigation. But still, the most important question remained unanswered: where was Asha Degree, and what had really happened to her? As the investigation into Elizabeth Short's death continued to stretch into decades, the case took on a mythic quality. The Black Dahlia murder had become not only one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history but also a symbol of the darker side of Hollywood and the mysterious nature of human violence. Theories, suspects, and speculation swirled for years, but the truth of what happened that night remains elusive. In the 2000s, new interest in the case emerged, thanks in part to the work of Steve Hodel, the son of Dr. George Hodel, who had spent years investigating his father's potential involvement in the murder. In his book, Black Dahlia Avenger, Steve argued that his father was the killer, and his findings were compelling to many. Steve's investigation uncovered disturbing facts about George Hodel's life, his connections to influential figures in Los Angeles, and his possible motive. Steve's work brought a fresh perspective to the case, and the theory of George Hodel's involvement in the Black Dahlia murder became one of the most widely discussed in the decades since Elizabeth's death. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, the case against George Hodel was never solid enough to bring him to trial. Hodel died in 1999, but his son's investigation continued to raise troubling questions about his past. Still, many remain skeptical about the connection, citing the lack of physical evidence linking George Hodel to the crime. The mystery surrounding Elizabeth Short's death remains unsolved, and her killer, if indeed George Hodel was the perpetrator, has never been brought to justice. In 2021, new forensic technology brought renewed hope to the investigation. Advances in DNA testing allowed investigators to re-examine the physical evidence collected at the crime scene, including hair and fibers that were recovered from Elizabeth Short's body. The possibility that modern forensic tools could provide a breakthrough in the case prompted a renewed investigation. Could DNA analysis finally reveal the killer's identity? Or would the Black Dahlia case remain an open wound in the annals of unsolved mysteries? Despite these advancements, the Black Dahlia case remained unsolved. Each new lead seemed to take investigators further away from the truth, and each suspect seemed to lead to a dead end. Theories about Hollywood corruption, serial killings, and personal vendettas continued to emerge, but none of them could provide definitive answers. The Black Dahlia case had taken on a life of its own, becoming a story not just about murder but about the nature of mystery itself, how sometimes, no matter how much we want to find answers, the truth slips through our fingers. The media frenzy surrounding Elizabeth Short's death had faded over the years, but her story continued to haunt the public consciousness. Documentaries, books, and films kept the case alive, each one adding a new layer to the mythology surrounding the Black Dahlia. Yet, despite all the attention, the killer remained anonymous, and Elizabeth Short's brutal murder remained an unsolved puzzle that would never be fully pieced together. For Elizabeth's family, the pain of her loss never truly faded. Though the investigation continued, and the case remained open, they never received the closure they so desperately needed. Elizabeth Short was more than just a victim of a gruesome crime. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. The unanswered questions surrounding her death left a void in her family's hearts, one that could never truly be filled. And so, the mystery of the Black Dahlia murder endures. With each passing year, the questions about Elizabeth Short's death continue to haunt those who investigate the case and those who follow it. Was George Hodel the killer? Was he part of a larger conspiracy, or was the killer someone else entirely? Was Elizabeth's murder the work of a deranged individual, or was it something more personal, an act of revenge or jealousy? These questions remain, as fresh as the day Elizabeth's body was found in that vacant lot in Los Angeles. In the end, the case remains open, but the answers seem just out of reach. The Black Dahlia case may never be solved, but it will never be forgotten. Elizabeth Short's murder is one of the darkest, most chilling mysteries in American history, and it continues to captivate the public's imagination, even as the years slip by. Perhaps one day, the truth will come to light, but for now, the mystery remains, unsolved, haunting, and endlessly fascinating.